All right. Well, if you haven't already, go ahead and open up your Bibles to Isaiah chapter 32. Isaiah chapter 32. We're going to attempt to get through chapter 32 and chapter 33 this morning. But before we dive into that, let's go to God in prayer, please. Our Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity this morning to come together to gather around your table and now to break open your word and to study it together. We ask that as we look at this passage this morning that we'll be encouraged to look to you for salvation and for deliverance and to know that you're capable of delivering us from any situation. But help us to lean wholly on you, to be willing to understand hard lessons when you dole them out our way, but to ultimately know that you are our rest, you are our peace, and that you can provide those things. And you come down from the highest place to the lowest low to pull us up to be established with you. And we thank you so much for that and for the ultimate King who reigns over us in your Son. And we ask that you help us to find rest and assurance in him. It's in his name that we pray this morning. Amen. All right. So we kind of are going through this section, and we'll have one more class on this particular section that we're in Isaiah, covering chapters 34 and 35. That will kind of be a bookend to the a section that started way back in Isaiah chapter 13, really talking about the woes and the oracles against the nation, or the burdens against the nations, and the judgment that was coming on them. Really showing that God is in control over all of this. But most recently, we started this section back in chapter 28 that was really dealing with the people in Judah specifically. And this section that we're in is kind of categorized by the 6 woes that you'll hear referred to, and we'll talk about those in just a second. But these 6 woes that are doled out against the people, and our last one, our 6th one, will be covered this morning. But it's really important, I think, especially as we get into this section this morning, to remember the historical context with where we're at, because this section will make a lot more sense, and a lot of the analogies and the imagery that Isaiah uses to paint this picture will be a lot more useful to you, a lot more meaningful if we understand what's going on with the people. So most likely this, from a historical standpoint, this is during the days of Hezekiah. And when Hezekiah is king, who is the enemy kind of out and about? Who are the people of Judah kind of struggling with constantly under Hezekiah? Yeah, the kingdom of Assyria. And during Hezekiah's day, does anybody remember who the name of the king of Assyria is? I think I heard it. Sennacherib, yeah. Be confident, Speak. We'll talk about this morning, but speak proudly. No stuttering, no mumbling this morning. Yeah, Sennacherib. And what is kind of Sennacherib most famous for, at least from a biblical narrative standpoint? Very powerful king. He sacked Babylon. Very kind of really was at the apex of the Assyrian domination of the world at that time. But from a biblical perspective, what's he most known for? Anybody remember? We'll cover it in detail here in a couple classes. Yes, that's exactly what I'm referring to. Whenever he is, dominates Israel and Samaria to the north, but then Isaiah kind of describes the Assyrians as like this flood waters that nothing's going to hold them back. They're going to overflow the banks, and they're going to come all the way, take Israel. They're going to make their way even into Judah, come up to the neck. You kind of see this imagery of this person kind of struggling in a flood of the torrents around them, and the waters coming up to the neck of the people in Judah at Jerusalem. But it stops there. It doesn't go any further, because that's when God gets involved, and we'll talk about that this morning. But this is a dominating force that has sacked everybody in their path. Sennacherib's records talk about how on his way down to Jerusalem, he takes 46 different Judean cities in the process, and I think carries away like 200,000 different Israelites and Judeans in the process. And so the people are in kind of a bad way. And we looked at this a couple of classes ago back in 28 and 29 when they get the report every morning that Sennacherib's on his way, and there's a new city that you're hearing about. You wake up and you get the morning report, a new city's been sacked, and you see the smoke on the horizon. You know that something bad is coming your way, and there's dread that's overtaking you, right? And Hezekiah and the people and the advisors of Hezekiah are trying to figure out their way to save themselves from this thing that's coming upon them. That we've got to figure out a way to withstand this pressure that's coming. We've got to fortify the walls. We've got to, change our whole aqueduct and water system to be able to withstand this force and stay within this city in this siege that's going to be definitely coming our way. And God's message throughout this whole process in this section is, I've got it. You trust in me. There's only one way. Nobody's withstood Assyria to date. There's only one way that you guys, you small, insignificant nation, are going to be able to stand against them and win, and it's if you trust in me. But the people continually try to figure out other ways to do it, and Kyle talked about it in detail in our last class, but what was their most recent way to try to tackle the situation? Yeah, let me call on Egypt, right? If Assyria is the fastest horse, Egypt's the second fastest. Let me try to bet on them, and maybe our forces combined will be able to withstand Assyria. But what does God say about Egypt and trust in Egypt? Don't do it. Why? Yeah, they're Rahab do nothing, right? Rahab, the dragon who sits still, Rahab just means do nothing, so that he calls Egypt to do nothing who does nothing, right? And so they're completely useless. Back in 28:29, he describes Egypt as this bed that's too short and a blanket that's not big enough, right? They're not going to be able to help you. You have to be willing to put your faith and your trust in God. And so the woes of this section, the 5 that we've covered thus far, have all been kind of pointing at the people specifically. And in 28, verse 1, we're talking about the actual pride, the woe to the crown of pride of Ephraim, which was Israel. And then moving into 29, woe to Ariel, which is Jerusalem. There's this the altar place of God. But you, if you continue in this way, are going to actually become the altar itself and be burnt up. And then 29:15, woe to those who seek deep to hide their counsel far from the Lord. So you had these advisors that were kind of trying to establish these secret connections and alliances with groups like Egypt to try to make their way out of it, and again, instead of trusting in God. And they're doing it kind of under the radar, trying to get away with it. Maybe God won't see us, and we can figure out our own way out of this mess. And then directly in 30 and 31, woe to those who are trusting in Egypt, this rebellious people who are trying to devise these plans, but they're not God's plans. I think that's kind of the emphasis of this section, and we'll carry over into our study this morning. But woe to these people who are devising these plans but not counseling God. They're seeking counsel, but it's from these foolish advisors, these foolish people who would set themselves up as noble, as honorable, and they've got the answers to the situations to get out of these things, but they're not consulting God. I mean, even Hezekiah goes all the way up to the top, right? I mean, Hezekiah is known as a righteous and good king who did a lot of good things in Judah and reestablished proper worship and the Passover and all these good things, but when the pressure comes to his door, he starts to falter. He starts to waver in his faith to God and trying to figure it out himself. And it's kind of the sad picture that's painted of even this prominent and good leader like Hezekiah, who is looking outside of God for deliverance until it finally comes up to the neck and it's outside the door in Sennacherib at the gates of Jerusalem that he finally says, well, if nothing else is working, I might as well pray. And lo and behold, that is what is his salvation when he turns to God. So we'll continue with these woes. The last one this morning, which will be kind of interesting, it starts in chapter 33, verse 1. But the last woe this morning is going to be against the enemies of God. So all these woes up to this point in time have been directed at God's people and their foolish actions in one way or another. But this morning, the final woe, the final is going to be against Assyria. All right, so let's dive in and read our text together this morning. In chapter 32, starting in verse 1, it says, "Behold, a king will reign in righteousness, and princes will rule in justice. Each will be like a hiding place from the wind, a shelter from the storm, like streams of water in a dry place, like the shade of a great rock in a weary land." So we stop, before we kind of dive into this any further, but like we've seen in Isaiah time and time again, there are these salvation oracles or these promises of deliverance or salvation kind of intermingled in with the judgment and the things that God's bringing upon the people to teach them a lesson or try to get them to see the right way. And so this picture that he's painting in these first 8 verses is really of an ideal, kind of messianic state in which things are going to be ultimately righted by God. Because right now everything's backwards. The people have gone so far away from God that things are distorted. Reality and their relationship with God is not what it is intended to be. And you see this kind of idyllic state of God righting the ship when this good king is reigning in righteousness, because you got to contrast it against the failures of the people of the day, right? So you've got a good king like Hezekiah, who comparatively speaking is a good king to the rest of the monarchs, but even he falls short of what a true and ultimately righteous king is supposed to be. And so you see the ideal picture painted here. In verse 3, it says, in those days, that's when the eyes of those who see will not be closed, and the ears of those who hear will give attention. The heart of the hasty will understand and know, and the tongue of the stammerers will hasten to speak distinctly. The fool will no more be called noble, nor the scoundrel said to be honorable. For the fool speaks folly, and his heart is busy with iniquity, to practice ungodliness, to utter error concerning the Lord, to leave the craving of the hungry unsatisfied, and to deprive the thirsty of drink. As for the scoundrel, his devices are evil. He plans wicked schemes, to ruin the poor with lying words, even when the plea of the needy is right. But he who is noble plans noble things, and on noble things he stands. All right? So in this period of reversal, when God sets things right, and there's this king that is this reigning in righteousness. Ever since the people, and we'll talk about this probably a little bit more in the next chapter, but ever since the people kind of requested a king from Samuel, from God, have those kings ever lived up to the standard of what they thought they were getting when they wanted the king? What do they want a king for? What's that? To be like the nations around them? Well, same thing? To fight for them? Isn't that ironic here, given the state of what God is trying to say, that just trust in me? But they wanted a king that went out and fought their battles for them. But none of the kings ever lived up to the standard of what they thought they were getting. This idyllic ruler who would, cause them to be not only just like the nations around them, but maybe superior to, because our king would be better. Our king would be a godly king. They'd go out and fight the battles for them. But what was Samuel's message? What was God's message to the people about what this king was really going to be? A burden? Yeah, how so? Taxes. They're gonna request your sons from you. Everything that you can think that you have in your prosperity, the king's going to require it of you, right? Because the king at the end of the day that they're getting or asking for is a man, right? Is a human being, and that is going to fall short and actually end up being kind of out for number one. They're going to be taking bribes. They're not going to be reigning in justice. They're going to be looking out for themselves. That's been the condemnation against the leaders and the nobles of the people up to this point in Isaiah, right? Has been, you guys have been prideful, you guys have been arrogant, you're not taking care of the needy, you're not looking out for the poor and oppressed in your people, and so this is going to ultimately kind of be your downfall. But this king is reigning in righteousness, and the princes, the leaders that kind of rule with him will do so in justice. And then in verse 2, I like verse 2, and really if you were paying attention to Lawrence's talk this morning around the Lord's Supper, that first section he was talking about is very, very much like this. Whenever you ask your neighbor, how's the things going, and they say, not good, then you can be their refuge, right? Because that's how it is in this idyllic state, that any man will be a hiding place from the wind and a cover from the tempest, as rivers of water in a dry place, as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. So they are people, the princes, the right people that are kind of in positions of authority, but even just the common folks, can be hiding places to their neighbors, right? And it's this restoration and this transformation that trusting in God brings is not only good for the individual, but it's good for society as a whole. When not only the people at large turn to God, but the people can rely on each other. A lot of the judgments and the destructions and the curses that Isaiah has talked about thus far have involved the people turning on each other, right? that they're going to start fighting against each other. They're going to be looking out for number one. Everybody's kind of, like Judges says, of doing what's right in their own eyes. But in this idyllic state of God's kingdom with this righteous ruler, everybody's looking out for other people. You've kind of got a Ruth and Boaz type scenario where things are better because people are trusting in God. This is the result of what happens when, as Isaiah said several times, when we pay attention and we implement the lessons and the things that God is trying to teach us in a proper way, we get the proper results. Remember the parable of the farmer from a few classes ago. His crop, his harvest that he's able to reap is good in what he is after because he pays attention to the natural order of God, the way God has set things up. And God, through the natural order of things, through the teachings that he's giving through the people and the prophets here, is for the betterment of the people if they will pay attention to what's going on. And sometimes the lessons that God is teaching as this Sennacherib, this massive fighting force right outside of the city, sometimes it's a hard lesson, and sometimes it's going to hurt. It's going to sting what's going on around you. Kyle talked about in our last class in chapter 30, verse 20, it says sometimes the Lord is going to give you the bread of affliction. But even that bread of affliction is for your betterment. It's so that you can be taught a lesson and implement that lesson, and things will be all the better for it. God's lessons, when they're received and when they're acted on, there's this true transformation. Things are for the better for the individual, for society. It's going to be a day when the fools aren't called noble anymore, and that's a day I think we're all looking forward to. And the people that are kind of set up in charge and people are looking to as influencers among the people, that they're just speaking foolishness. They're the ones that are still just looking out for number one. They're not paying attention to the greater and grander scheme of what's at stake. But in those days, the fools will no longer be called noble. It'll be the ones, verse 8, I like the way it ends. It'll be the noble man that devises or plans noble things, and on noble things he stands. That's the idyllic state. And the New King James Version, I like its translation as well. It says, a generous man devises generous things. I like the idea of the association of noble things and generosity, right? Again, the collective good for the people. This when we transform ourselves and fully dedicate ourselves, have this real relationship with God, everybody is better off for it because we're all working in accord, or even the best of us or the most established of us are setting ourselves up in connection with God. So it's for the betterment of ourselves and those around us. All right, verse 9. It says, rise up, you women who are at ease. So now we're going to transition from this idyllic state in the first 8 verses to the reality of what's actually happening in Jerusalem and in Judah with the people. And he uses the women here as kind of this, and he did this before back in chapter 4, but he's going to use the women as just kind of this illustrative point about how they are thinking everything is okay based on their luxury and the seemingly blessed lifestyle that they're living, but ultimately they're focusing on the blessing and not realizing the true state of things around them. They're the ones who are not paying attention and will be the worse off for it. He says, rise up, you women who are at ease, hear my voice, you complacent daughters, give ear to my speech. In little more than a year you will shudder, you complacent women, for the grape harvest fails and the fruit harvest will not come. Tremble, you women who are at ease, shudder, you complacent ones, strip and make yourselves bare and tie sackcloths around your waist. Beat your breast for the pleasant fields, for the fruitful vine, for the soil of my people growing up in thorns and briars. Yes, for all the joyous houses and the exultant city. For the palace is forsaken, the populous city deserted. The hill and the watchtower will become dens forever, a joy of wild donkeys, a pasture of flocks. So what's he condemning here in these women? How does he describe them? Got 2 highlighted words up there. Yeah, complacent. What does that mean? Don't care, just okay with what's going on. They're just going about their life because, why mess with it? Just going along. But he's saying, pay attention. Again, hear my voice. Listen to what I'm saying, because in a little more than a year, the reason that you feel complacent, the reason that you feel at ease, I'm going to take it away. And then where is your complacency going to be? Where is your rest? Where is your confidence ultimately going to be? Because in a little more than a year, the Assyrian force is going to be outside of your gates, right? You can't even get outside to, whether this harvest, failing here is an actual natural event, or you cannot go out and do your farming work because the army's out there and you're inside behind the walls of the city, and there's nothing that you can do to go out there and actually do your job. But whatever the case may be, you're not going to be able to bring in and take in the thing in which you're finding your peace and your security right now. When that's taken away from you, you're going to be trembling. You're going to be mourning because you've lost the thing that you trusted in, right? And that's ultimately God's point here is when you trust in all these physical things, be that your good looks, when he used the female analogy back in chapter 4, it's your good looks, your money, your job, your political alliances, your military strength, all of that can be taken away in an instant via natural means, God's intervention, other people taking it from you. If you trust in that, you will lose it. And where is your confidence going to be? How are you going to react when that comes to pass, right? But if you have this trust in God, and he'll talk about that as we go along, there's going to be this quietness and this peace, even though things might be bad and you're still being served the bread of adversity, you have a steadiness or a balancing in your life because of this ultimate trust that you have in God. And so he's calling on them to actually mourn. Go ahead and start mourning the current state of things. Even though this event is a year away, if you're not going to change, if you're not going to pay attention to the words of God, then go ahead and start mourning. Go ahead and get a kickstart on it, because that's what's going to happen. That's how it's going to come to pass. Because when this comes down, all your joyous houses there in the middle of verse 13, your joyous houses in the exultant city, they're all going to be forsaken, right? You're this place of joy, place of prosperity. The people are eating and drinking and being merry, but when this comes down the pipe, everybody's going to be mourning and dreadful about the current state of things. It's going to be like a city that's just these ruins left in it, and the only people that are going to be happy at that time are the wild donkeys, right? Just because they don't have to be inside of a pen anymore. They're going to be able to roam free because there's no more walls. The walls have been knocked down. So it's this ultimate picture of curse and destruction. You've got the references to the thorns and the briars that are growing up and have overtaken the city. It's this state of cursedness as opposed to God's blessing that we saw in the first 8 verses there. And that's going to continue in that state. That's what you can expect until God's Spirit is poured out, starting in verse 15. Until the Spirit is poured out on us from on high, and the wilderness becomes this fruitful field, and the fruitful field is deemed a forest. Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and the righteousness abide in the fruitful field. And the effect of righteousness will be peace, and the result of righteousness, quietness and trust forever. My people will abide in a peaceful habitation, in secure dwellings, in a quiet resting place. Though hail comes down on the forest, and the city is brought low in humiliation, blessed are you who sow beside all waters, and who send out freely the feet of the ox and the donkey. So you've got this transformation again that happens when God gets involved, and it can only happen when God gets involved. And you see him talking about the pouring out of his Spirit. Pouring out is, I think Kyle brought this up in our last class. You've got several illustrations to water in a desert, dry environment, right? And so this pouring out is kind of this abundance of resources that are kind of flowing out on the people. And you see the illustration is kind of pictured in a natural one, so that they can kind of see the fulfillment of it. But the Spirit that's poured out on the people, and the wilderness, that dry and barren land, becomes this fruitful field, and this fruitful field becomes this lush and green forest. Everything gets better when we allow God to get involved for our betterment. You see the differences to what we've already seen, verse 4 or in the previous verses. In verse 10, you had this lack of harvest that the people couldn't depend on, and now you've got this fertile land in verse 15. You had this false complacency and security in verse 10, and now you've got this secureness and this undisturbed state of a reliance on God In verse 14, the cities and the exalted places were desolate, but now people here dwell in their homes in peace and security. In verse 14, you had cattle kind of hold up in the city because they cannot go out because the armies are at the gates, and now these oxen and the donkeys are getting to roam free, and you're getting to walk beside waters and sow wherever you want because there's no enemies about you. God is with you. God is your protection. There's no more need for these walls. But the point in this section is God has to be involved to make this happen. This does not come about by man's plans, devising something that gets them out of this rough place. It only can occur when the Spirit of God is poured out from on high. And so you have this peace that's established, and it's interesting actually from the Hebrew perspective. The word that's used for peace or secure or undisturbed nature is the same that's used for complacency. So that false peace, that false complacency that you trick yourself into having just based on you looking at your immediate surroundings is compared with this true and legitimate and peace and prosperity and quietness and trust that we can have in God. And then I like verse 19, talks about, I have several versions. I actually stuck a different version in here from the ESV, but it says, though hail comes down on the forest and the city is brought low in humiliation. So there is a judgment coming on these people, and they don't need to lose sight of that. There is a judgment coming down, hail that is going to come down, humiliation is going to be brought down on the people. But blessed are those who receive it, take stock of what it is, because it is a lesson that God is trying to dole out on his people, implement that lesson like the wise farmer, and then get to receive the benefits of putting their hope and their faith and their trust in God. All right. Now he turns his attention to the final woe in this section, turning his attention to Assyria specifically. He says, woe to you, the destroyer, or those who plunder. For you have not been plundered, and you who deal treacherously, though they have not dealt treacherously with you. When you cease plundering, you will be plundered. And when you make an end of dealing treacherously, they will deal treacherously with you. O Lord, be gracious to us. We have waited for you. Be their arm every morning, our salvation also in the time of trouble. At the noise of the tumult of the people all the people shall flee. When you lift up yourself, the nations shall be scattered, and your plunder shall be gathered, like the gathering of the caterpillar, as the running to and fro of locusts, he shall run upon them. The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He has filled Zion with justice and righteousness. Wisdom and knowledge will be the stability of your times, and the strength of salvation. The fear of the Lord is his treasure. So now you've got this final woe in this section actually being directed against Assyria, the people's enemy. The other 5 woes were against God's people. And so now for God to ultimately to cause this transformation and this transition and setting things right, one of the things he's got to do is remove the rod of correction that he's been using against him, hanging up his war bow, like in the flood narrative, right? Whenever Noah's flood, he hangs the bow, and the word that in Hebrew that's used for bow is actually like a bow and arrow. Hangs up his war bow that I'm not going to use this against you in this capacity anymore. And so now he's got to do the same thing with Assyria. He's called them back in chapter 10 as this rod of discipline, this rod of correction, this tool that he was using to try to discipline his people and teach his people a lesson. He's got to put that away because I don't know if you remember back in chapter 10, but what was the overall thoughts of the king of Assyria? He's being used by God, maybe he doesn't realize it, but what does he think about himself? Yeah, he's unstoppable. No one can come against me. And that's when we see the actual narrative in the next couple of chapters, that's what the Rabshakeh's message is. Who has stood against me? Mary? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that's kind of and I remember, and I think it's online on the website somewhere, but Sterling Borders preached a lesson from that particular passage of several years ago, but it was called, lies mixed with truth, all right? And so there is some truth that God was using Assyria as this tool to carry out his his vengeance on the people, but not for utter destruction. It was for, a training, for a disciplining. And that's, I think and that's back in chapter 10 of Isaiah, that was Isaiah's message to the king of Assyria, that you've got complete destruction on your mind because that's what you think you are. Right? And so that's the kind of the lies mixed with truth of what they said. That, you can't trust Hezekiah. He's brought down all of your worship places, right? Which was true because they were worshiping improperly. They were worshiping in the high places, the Asherah poles, the false idols. And Hezekiah took all that away. And so Sennacherib kind of twists that a little bit, like, wait, is God going to save you after you've really changed your whole method of worship? If you think about the common people, they don't quite fully understand exactly what's going on there. But I think the point being, God's now getting involved, saying, all right, that's far enough. I've used you for what you need to be used for. You're prideful, you're arrogant, now you're going to get a taste of your own medicine. Because when you're done, that's what the verse 1 is kind of talking about, when you're done plundering, when you're done acting treacherously, now you're going to get your own taste of it. Right? And so that's what God is bringing on the people. And then you have Isaiah's prayer there in verses 2 through 4 about calling on God to be gracious to the people, to rise up, to do something about it, because they have this understanding now of, this is kind of the idea of the prayer that they're going to bring to God when nothing else has worked, right? Now that the enemy's outside of the gates, this army of, 200,000 plus people are outside, and nothing has stopped them up to this point in time. What else are we going to do? Well, let's try calling out and crying out to God. And so we know that you can do this, God. If you raise up, the nations will scatter, and the plunder that they will leave behind, we can jump on it, right away, because like locusts that are kind of going on to some type of a crop, we can get it, and we can be the better for it if you get involved on our behalf, because He is the one who ultimately dwells on high, and has this. I like the way verse 6 says it. The wisdom and the knowledge of God will be the stability of their times. Right? We talked about it a couple of classes ago, but I think it was in chapter 29 about how this was a people that had drawn near to God with their lips, but their hearts were far from them. But a true relationship with God, a true wisdom and knowledge of Him brings a stability to your life. Right? That type of imagery is used throughout the Psalms, throughout Isaiah, about a foundation that's not good enough when it's not based on God. The cornerstone that isn't Christ Himself or God in our lives, it won't stand. It won't work properly. But a real and legitimate relationship with God brings stability, brings peace, brings strength and salvation. If we'll bring or come to Him not only with our lips but also with our hearts as well, because I like the in there, verse 6 too, the fear of the Lord is His treasure. Some versions might say the key to His treasure, but the idea of the relationship with God and understanding of who He is, that's where it starts. You got to have a relationship with God. Yep. Yeah. No, I think. Yeah, I know it's funny when you look at a story like this, one that we're relatively familiar with, and we know how it ultimately plays out. But you're exactly right. It's sometimes God has to bring you down so that you'll get it, right? And that's I think the key of this particular passage is understanding that adversity, when it comes our way, pay attention to it. Maybe there's a message there that God is trying to get some point across to you. Maybe that point is just as simple as put your trust in Him, not in anything else. Right? And that's been this section here, and starting back in chapter 28 of don't try to scramble around and figure it out yourself. Just be quiet, rest in God, and know that He's in control and is ultimately working things out for His glory and ultimately your betterment as well. All right, verse 7. You've got where are we at from a time perspective? 5 minutes. All right, it is 10:30, right? I think so. When we get between the Sunday and Wednesday and having 40 minutes or 45 minutes, I'll lose my cool a little bit. So So you've got here in verse 7 this picture now, and again, keep in mind the historical context. You've got the valiant ones that are crying outside. The ambassadors of peace are starting to weep bitterly because they're trying, remember the people on the walls when Sennacherib was there, they're trying to call out and just speak to us in Aramaic. Don't talk to us in Hebrew. We can understand you. And so they're like, no, we're going to speak in the language so everybody can hear, because we want everybody to know how bad this is going to be when we actually finally get inside. So these ambassadors, these nobles are, trying to work out some kind of a deal with Assyria, but it's not going to work because they don't have any respect or any care for anybody. They're going to do what they want, when they want, how they want. The highways outside the city are lying waste. Nobody's traveling because there's this horde of Assyrian troops just outside the gates. Nobody can make a move. Nobody can get around. The earth itself is pictured as one that's kind of lamenting this current state of things. But then, verse 10, God gets involved. Now he's like, okay, that's far enough, Assyria. I'm going to rise up. I am going to lift myself up, and you will conceive chaff. You will bring forth stubble. Your breath as a fire shall devour you. So whatever you think you're capable of doing, it's not going to come to fruition because I'm getting involved and I'm putting an ultimate stop to it. And they were prideful, they were arrogant, and we'll see their speech that they kind of dole out against God, against the people, against Hezekiah. God's kind of saying your breath, your words will be kind of the fire that is going to kindle this destruction that's ultimately going to come upon you. You're bringing this on yourself to a certain degree. Verse 13, hear you guys who are afar off at what I have done, and you who are near acknowledge my might. So pay attention to what God is doing, because this is not how God has worked in the past. This is not just raising up a rival army to come in and kind of carry out his will, but God is going to directly get involved. He says, I will get involved and do this. And he causes his spirit to go throughout the camp of the Assyrians and destroy 185,000 of them in one night. It was like a bad dream when the Assyrians wake up. A couple of chapters ago we read. And then what's the people's reaction when they see God get involved to this degree? Verse 14. As we've seen already in Isaiah chapter 6, when you actually come into the presence of a holy God, what's the immediate reaction? Yeah, uh-oh. I'm in a bad way, right? We've seen this before. We've seen it in Isaiah chapter 6 already, with Peter, when he kind of has that realization that God is in control of nature. This woe is me. I'm a sinful man. Depart from me. Get away from me. You think about it in terms of kind of the Exodus event, which we talked about a little bit this morning. Whenever the people are at Mount Sinai and they experience God's presence and fire and calamity and smoke on the mountain, what do they say to Moses? You do it. You stand between us. We don't want to have any kind of direct confrontation. Paul will make use of that later. Because when we would come down from the mountain, his face would glow and shine, and he had to wear this veil. And Paul will kind of use that, saying, when we with unveiled faces, behold him. That's the real relationship that Paul is kind of calling on us to have with God. Because this realization that God is getting involved like this, verse 14, the sinners of Zion are afraid, and they'll be seized with fear because they realize their hypocritical state in which they've been living. And so they ask this question, who could possibly dwell in the midst of this consuming fire? And what's the answer to that question? Verse 15. Who can withstand this presence? Yeah, the ones who walk righteously, who speak uprightly, the one who despises, distorted ways of oppression for gain, the one who refuses bribes, the one who doesn't even entertain murderous plans. Somebody comes to somebody and says, I've got a good idea of a way to kind of make a quick buck, and doesn't even entertain that. They refuse to even give sin a foothold in their life. That is the one who can withstand God's destruction here. But as those who ultimately put themselves at the mercy of God, right? The ones who ultimately realize their state and turn to him, because that was Isaiah's response as well. I'm undone, and God says, well, I will put you back together. I'm going to solder you back together with coal from my altar. Verse 17 through the end of the chapter, you get a real picture of what's happening with the city, because you've got the idea of this king now that's walking around in his beauty, and you're going to say in your heart, remember that time when it was so bad? Remember how bad it got and how God ultimately delivered us. If pain or bad things that come your way, it's kind of a funny thing. You can't remember pain. You can remember something hurt, but you can't remember what it felt like. And that's kind of what he's saying here. Remember the officers that were outside the city? Where are they at now? Remember the ones who were looking at our towers, figuring out how to bring them down? Remember the guy who was counting the money that we gave him as tribute? Where are they? They're gone. You don't have to deal with them anymore because God got involved in your behalf because you put your trust in him. That's kind of the end of that section there. But we'll pick up with wrapping up the section on Wednesday.